You are listening to TBR Radio presents The Dixie Heritage Show, with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed Devries.
Today's radio show is one that I recorded back in December. I'm going to voice over just a little bit of it here at the beginning because some of the information that I gave you can since be updated. As we know, we're in the process of moving our offices and our studio to Maryland, and that move has been blessed in many ways, but it's also been delayed and complicated in many ways. It's been a very hard move. It's been a very stressful move. At this particular moment, I am in what is left of the studio and office in Florida. About half of our stuff is in Maryland in storage. About half of it is here in Florida. We are under contract on a property right now, and Lord willing, we will close on that at the 31st of this month. Pray for us. Our goal was to be completely there by the 24th of the month. We're not going to reach that goal. I will be going back up to Maryland on the 24th. I'll be taking another trailer load of stuff up there, and then we'll be about 3/4 of the way moved up there, at least stuff-wise. And Lord willing, we can close at the end of the month and start moving into and setting up our new offices and studios. We will see. Pray that God will enable that to happen. You should be listening to this sometime on the 17th of January or after then. It's possible that some of your prayers will have needed to be answered before you even prayed them. But again, what does the Bible tell us? It says that God answers even before we call, and so I'm asking you to pray. And of course there'll be other things that will still be hanging and pending, and your prayers will be very important to the success of this move. And so with that said, let's go ahead and jump into this third broadcast for the year 2020 of the TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Show, and we will be talking about my article in the January-February issue of TBR Magazine on Jesse James. Maybe you saw last week's program, or maybe you're looking at the video on this week's program and you're saying, you know, it's a little buggy, it's a little jittery. I'm not using the normal equipment. I'm recording it on a MacBook. And, God blessed us with this MacBook. Someone was gracious enough to give us a used MacBook. It's an older device, and I'm having a hard time getting it to do everything that I needed to do to produce a show. If I can get this to work right, we'll be able to produce shows. So if I don't have all the equipment hooked up in Maryland, when we need to resume our production schedule, hopefully I'll be able to produce them here on this MacBook. But anyways, pray for the MacBook too. Pray that I can get that set up again. Maybe God will answer even before you call. But in today's broadcast, what I want to talk about is I want to talk about my second article in the February 2020 issue of the Barnes Review magazine. The Barnes Review, TBR, of course, being the TBR in TBR Radio Presents. And so what I want to do is I want to talk about the second article. Last week we talked about Lottie Moon being a Confederate spy, and this week I want to talk about Jesse James, who was a Baptist bandit. The January-February issue of TBR Magazine is an Americana-themed issue. So getting away from a lot of the things you normally read in the Barnes Review, a lot of times we're talking about World War II and European history and so forth. We're really focusing on Americana, I believe. And I'm saying this before the issue has gone to press, so there could be editorial changes that Paul Angel, our executive editor, will order. So if I say something in error, that's the reason, and please forgive me. But as it stands right now, there's a Buffalo Bill article that's going in there. There's some Old West articles that are going in there and so forth. And so Paul Angel, our executive editor, thought that my article that I had been writing on Jesse James would be a really good fit. I've been working on a book about Jesse James for the last 12 or 13 years now, and I had kind of put together a synopsis of the book and sent it to Paul and said, what do we do with this? How do I move forward with this? And he told me, he said, well, let's take that synopsis and let's make that an article for the magazine. And he told me about the Americana issue, and yeah, that's a great fit. So I kind of retooled the synopsis a little bit into an article. Let me just ask you some questions. You talk about alternate universes, if you will. And I don't know, maybe I shouldn't run off on this tangent, but do any of our listeners watch the television show on the CW network called The Flash? You know, I used to like that show a whole lot. I'd sit there and watch it every week with my teenage son. He's really into, the comic book stuff and all that. And so we'd watch The Flash together, and that was all. It's always been fun. But this last episode, the show has just gone off the rails. It's just gone crazy. It's almost to the point the storyline is just broken down, and it's so absurd now. But anyways, if you watch The Flash, you know, of course, that they have what they call the multiverse. And so you have Earth 1, Earth 2, Earth 3, Earth 4, Earth 5, Earth 6, Earth 473, Earth 474, Earth 475. In other words, you have all these different Earths in the multiverse. In other words, all these different dimensions, if you will, in the universe. And so let's just say there's an alternate dimension somewhere. Maybe there's an alternate dimension somewhere where Lex Luthor is the superhero and Superman is the bad guy, okay? What if there's an alternate universe somewhere where Jesse James was not a bad guy? What if there is an alternate universe somewhere where Jesse James was not an outlaw? What if there is an alternate universe somewhere where Jesse James was not a thief and a robber and a murderer? What if there's an alternate universe somewhere where Jesse James was an honorable man? What if there's an alternate universe somewhere where Jesse James was a decorated combat veteran who served his country with distinction and with pride? An alternate universe where Jesse James was a pastor of a Baptist church. Not just one Baptist church, but 5 Baptist churches. What if there's an alternate universe where Frank James was a deacon, where the members of the James gang were Sunday school teachers and choir members? An alternate universe where Cole Younger was a Baptist tent evangelist. What if that alternate universe were our own? And that's what I wrote about in the January-February 2020 issue of the Barnes Review magazine in an article that I have titled Baptist Bandits. That article name may be changed by the time the magazine had gone to press, but by the time you're listening to this, the magazine should be available, and you can go to barnesreview.org and you can find out how to get a copy of the article and the 2020 issue of the magazine for January-February 2020 issue. Jesse James, his great-grandfather, comes to the United States. He comes to Virginia. He is a Baptist preacher. He comes to preach the gospel to the colonists in the Virginia Bay colony. His son would be a preacher. Jesse James's father would go to a very small Baptist college. It was the first Baptist college to be built on the western side of the Allegheny Mountains. And he would study for the ministry. And while he is studying for the ministry, he goes to Kentucky and he preaches a protracted meeting, which is what they used to call revival meetings back then. And they called them protracted meetings because revival meetings didn't just go 3 days or 5 days or 7 days or even 2 weeks back then. Sometimes they would go 2 months, 3 months, 4 months at a time. And so they called it a protracted meeting. And they would just keep meeting every night until the Holy Ghost stopped showing up, basically, until people stopped getting saved, until people stopped walking the aisle, until people stopped repenting of their sins, until, the meetings were just no longer bearing fruit. That's when they would stop them. And so Jesse's father is preaching one of these protracted meetings, and he meets a young woman named Zerelda. And she walks the aisle in one of his meetings, and he's just struck by her. And so even after the protracted meeting ends, he continues to make regular trips to her family's farm to court her. And they're married. And they have 4 children. He graduates from seminary. They go to Missouri. He starts 3 churches. His son Jesse would eventually pastor all 3 of those churches. He starts William Jewell College, which is to this day even the flagship college of the Missouri Baptist Convention. And having founded the college, having started these churches, having baptized more people west of the Mississippi than anybody else, probably the Billy Graham of his day, Jesse James's father decides that somebody needs to preach the gospel to the 49ers, to the people who were engaged in the gold rush out in California. And so what does he do? He starts to head west, and he preaches the gospel. And he sees a lot of the miners saved, and he establishes a church there out in California. But before he could bring his family back, or bring his family to California from Missouri, he succumbs to a pneumonia that he caught when he was traveling across the desert to get to California. It gets very cold in the desert at night. In fact, there was one time I was traveling, and I was driving across Arizona, and I stopped for the night, and I slept in my car. And during the day, it was so hot that I could, even with the air conditioner blowing full blast, I could feel the heat coming in through the windshield. And then I stopped for the night at a post office parking lot there on an Indian reservation somewhere. And at some point in the night, I woke up and I was freezing. The desert's just a hard place to camp in at night. And he had succumbed to pneumonia. And so Jesse's father has died. Jesse was just a small boy at the time. I want to say he was three years old, if my memory serves. Frank, I think, was about 5 years old at the time. So they didn't know their father all that well. They inherited their father's library. And Frank would be an avid reader of his father's theology books, as would Jesse. Jesse would just absorb his father's theology books. Frank, on the other hand, stuck more to Shakespeare and the classics, philosophy, works like Plato and Homer, whereas Jesse just stayed entirely in the theology works and a little bit of history. They both, of course, were avid readers of their father's Bible, and they memorized large portions of the King James Version.
Open your web browser and type in www.barnesreview.org and discover the Barnes Review magazine. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There is no more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review magazine in its print form, or in convenient electronic delivery. Our host has been a subscriber to both formats for years. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
Jesse James is now 13 years old. We fast forwarded a few years. It's Thanksgiving. It's time for the family's Thanksgiving meal. Jesse comes downstairs from his room. He comes to the kitchen table, or the dining room table, and he tells his family that God has called him to preach the gospel and that he has surrendered himself to the ministry. And for the next few months, Jesse James just pours himself into his father's theology books even more than he had before. Of course, he goes to church and he starts ministerial training there in the local church, which was a church that his father had founded, had pastored. Of course, his dad hadn't pastored there in about a decade now because his dad has been dead for that long. But Jesse begins his ministerial training there. War between the states breaks out. Frank joins the Confederate Army. Jesse can't join, he's too young. Frank goes off to war. Frank catches some kind of an illness, like I don't know if it was like a rheumatism or if it was a pneumonia. Frank is ill. So they send Frank home to recover, to die, whatever. Frank doesn't die of the illness, he recovers from it, but his army unit had gone too far away and he can't rejoin it. And so Frank joins himself to the first unit that he can get a hold of. And that just happens to be a group of partisan rangers that is commanded by a man named William Clark Quantrell. Frank is camping with Quantrell. Frank becomes Quantrell's adjutant. Becomes his right-hand man, his second officer there. The person who takes down his reports and who, just basically, makes sure that his orders get passed down and so forth. The Yankees become very interested in Frank because the Yankees want Quantrell and they hope to get to Quantrell through Frank. They go to the James farm thinking that the Jameses would know where Frank is, and obviously if they can find Frank, they can find Quantrell and his men in their camp and so forth. I don't know if Dr. Samuels, who was Frank and Jesse's stepfather, their mother had remarried.
I don't know if Dr. Samuels did not know the location of where Frank James and Quantrell's raiders were camping, or if he just refused to give up the information. I don't know. In any event, when he could not give the Yankees the information that they wanted, they put a noose around his neck, and they put it over the rafter in the barn, and they were going to hang Dr. Samuels. Jesse walks into the barn seeing this. He immediately shoots one of the Yankees. The others flee. He cuts Dr. Samuels down. Dr. Samuels' life is spared, but he had lost a lot of blood flow to the brain and would basically be retarded, mentally not right for the rest of Dr. Samuels' life. He would have the mentality of a child. That would be the effect of what had happened when the Yankees had attempted to hang him there in his own barn. And so, got a Yankee lying dead in the barn. A couple of other Yankees have run away. There's a Yankee in the house who's in the process of trying to rape Jesse's mother. Hears the gunshots. But he just figures that's his Yankee buddies taking care of Dr. Samuels, so he proceeds with his business. Jesse walks in the house, literally catches that Yankee with his pants down. Of course, Jesse will now kill another Yankee. 2 dead Yankees. That's going to get back to the Yankee camp. Probably the whole Yankee army is going to come in and exact its revenge. Jesse's mother tells him, you have got to run away. You've got to get as far away from here as you can go, and you got to get there as fast as you can get there. Jesse has nowhere else to go, so he goes to Quantrell's army camp, because that's where his brother is. That's the only place he knows to go. He tells the story to his brother. Of course, Jesse's tried to enlist in Quantrell's unit on a number of occasions, but Quantrell will not have him because he's too young. That being said, Quantrell understands that Jesse James is... and that he's just killed 2 Yankees. He had good reason for killing them. He realizes Jesse can't go home, so he reluctantly agrees to allow Jesse to stay in the camp on condition that Frank looks after him and is responsible for him. He won't let Jesse join the army, but obviously everybody in camp has to carry their weight some way or another. And so Jesse would cook, Jesse would clean, Jesse would load pistols and rifles for the soldiers. He was busying himself about camp. Jesse James one night is cleaning a pistol. It accidentally goes off, and it shoots off one of his fingers. And Jesse James yells out, "That's the dang dingus pistol I ever did see." Jesse did not use profanity, neither did Frank. And his comrades were so impressed or just flabbergasted by the fact that even having shot his finger off, Jesse did not use profanity. And so Jesse's nickname from that name forward became Dingus. And so now you know how he got the nickname Dingus. But Jesse and Frank, they didn't drink, they didn't smoke. They were always faithful to their wives. They didn't even cuss, even in the army camp. Extra, read all about it. If you're like me, and I'll bet you are, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Extra, read all about it. Jesse's working around the camp. He's cleaning guns. He's loading pistols. And the Yankees, having discovered the camp, decide to attack the camp at night. It literally, it's an ambush. They're taken by surprise. It's every man for himself. They begin fighting back against the Yankees. As the story is told, Jesse mounts a horse. Jesse gallops and gallops and gallops with a pistol in each hand, the reins in his teeth. Gallops through the camp. He's just shooting. Every bullet drops a Yankee. He gets to the end of the camp, he reloads, he comes back, he does it again. You know, every bullet dropping a Yankee. When the dust had settled and the Yankees were dead or gone, and the Confederates are regrouping, and they're still alive for the most part, Bill Anderson, you probably know him as Bloody Bill Anderson, which was a nickname that he didn't deserve, but anyways, Bill Anderson is second in command in Quantrell's unit. And Anderson looks at Quantrell. He says, "I don't care how young the kid is. I want him." Quantrell agreed. And Jesse James was now officially enlisted in the Confederate Army. He would become Anderson's adjutant, Anderson's right-hand man. And so, Jesse had no choice but to join the Confederate Army. Granted, he wanted to do it earlier in the war, but he couldn't because he was too young. But by this point, he had no choice. In other words, Jesse didn't invite the Yankees to his house to try to kill his stepdad and rape his mother. And so the first two people that Jesse James would kill, he killed not in cold blood, not because he was a murderer, not because he was some crazy kid. He killed them in defense of his family. In other words, they were what we would call today justifiable homicides. They were necessary. So Jesse lost no honor in committing these acts. And so the war was thrust upon him. And the war becomes very real for Jesse James. And here Jesse is, and he's in the Confederate Army. Anyways, let's move along a little bit. The raid on Lawrence, Kansas. Quantrell got a bad rap for that, but the reality was there was a town called, there's a group of Yankees called the Jayhawkers, and they were just a bloodthirsty group of no-goods. And they weren't actually engaging in legitimate warfare. I mean, they were just raping and pillaging, and they had taken all of the soldiers in Quantrell's army, and they had they found out who their wives were, who their girlfriends were, who their sisters were, who their mothers were, who their grandmothers were, and so forth. And they rounded them up, and they took them across the border into Kansas. And they took them to a town called Lawrence, Kansas, and they held them as prisoners in a very unsafe wood-framed house. And were basically forcing them into prostitution, forcing them to be whores for Yankee soldiers. And basically their jail was a brothel for these Yankee soldiers to come and, take advantage of these women. And so Quantrell and his men rode across the border into Lawrence, Kansas, to avenge their womenfolk and to rescue their womenfolk and so forth. And so, the whole story of Quantrell's raid into Lawrence, Kansas, if you're believing the conventional history version, you just need to restudy that subject, because the raid into Lawrence, Kansas was, again, an honorable action on the part of Quantrell and Anderson, and of course, Frank and Jesse James, Cole Younger, and others. And so Jesse had an honorable service in the Confederate military. Quantrell was a Baptist. Anderson was a Baptist. These were Christian gentlemen. Quantrell was a school teacher before the war. The war was thrust upon these men. They did what they had to do. But these men couldn't even go home on the weekends to go to church, because the Yankees were staking out all their churches trying to find them. And so they had to have church services in their own army camp on the weekends. And now, a lot of the men that made up Quantrell's company were men from the 5 Baptist churches that Robert James, the father of Frank and Jesse James, had pastored before his death. And so a lot of these men were the spiritual fruit, if you will, of Robert James's ministry. And now these men can't go to their churches on the weekend, so they have to have church in the army camp. And so Frank and Jesse James become the chaplains of the army camp. Of course, a lot of the respect that their fellow soldiers had for them was based on respect that these men had for their father in the church. And so Frank and Jesse James become the chaplains. Jesse more than Frank, but Frank would preach some as well. And they would preach in the army camp, and they would have services for the soldiers. And so Jesse James's ministry as a Baptist preacher begins in the midst of this horrible, horrible war. And so Jesse and Frank are serving God, and they're serving their country, and they're doing both honorably, and they're doing both sincerely. The war ends. At the end of the war, they go to surrender. But Quantrell and his men were not allowed by the Yankees to surrender. Frank and Jesse and some others were attempting surrender somewhere where they thought maybe they wouldn't be recognized as having been Quantrell's men. They thought they would surrender, they'd give their loyalty oath to the Union, they'd get their names down on the paper, they'd go home. Instead, some infernal Yankee soldier decides to shoot Jesse in the back while he's attempting to surrender and give the loyalty oath to the United States. So surrender is not an option for Frank and Jesse. So the war will go on for them, and it will continue to go on, and it will continue to go on, and it will continue to go on. And so now you know the foundation of how Frank and Jesse James wound up in Confederate service, how Frank and Jesse James, how the war couldn't end for them. After this, they would go into hiding. There was a pastor of one of the churches that Jesse's father Robert had pastored. I can't remember the name of the church now, but it was the church that Quantrell was a member of. And they managed to get Jesse to this pastor's farm. And he manages to recover from his gunshot wound and to regain his health there. But these men are on the lam, they're on the run, because it's a perpetual battle for them, because the Yankees won't let them surrender. They've been accused of war crimes that they did not commit. There is a death sentence that is over them. If they're to be found, they're to be killed or given to proper quote-unquote authorities so that they can be killed and so forth. These men, the men who would eventually ride in the James gang, all the men who served with Quantrell, these are men who are not allowed to surrender. They have to live on the lam. They have to live as fugitives for the rest of their lives. And there are not a lot of career choices that are open to fugitives. And yet, somehow or another, Jesse James manages to pastor 5 Baptist churches as a fugitive, living that life. You say, well, wasn't Jesse an outlaw? Yes, he was, in the sense that he robbed banks and that he robbed trains. Jesse would be recruited by a group called the Order of the Golden Circle. The Order of the Golden Circle would form an underground Confederate government. General Albert Pike would become the president of this underground Confederate government and the commander-in-chief of the Confederate military. And so he would enlist Jesse James to raise money and supplies for what was going to be the second attempt of a war for Southern independence, that war never being fought. And so when Jesse robbed a bank, he only robbed the bank when he knew that a large shipment of Yankee gold or money was coming through that bank. And then he would rob exactly the amount of money that was on temporary deposit in that bank, but he would leave the local people's money in the vault. He didn't steal their money. He only stole the Yankee money that was moving through the bank. The locals loved Jesse because, he was no threat to them. If anything, he was sticking it to the Yankees, something that they wished that they could still be doing. In addition to that, there were train robberies. But again, military supplies were moving west to supply the U.S. Army that was fighting the Indians. And so Jesse would rob those westbound trains, and he would relieve them of military supplies. And occasionally there were shipments of Yankee gold and silver that were, moving east, from the west to the east, or Yankee money moving from the east to the west, and he might relieve the train of that as well. Frank and Jesse didn't rob the passengers. In fact, they would go in and sing hymns with the passengers while the gang relieved this cargo of the military cargo and so forth from the rear cars. You say, but what about all these reports of Jesse and Frank killing people and robberies? Well, there were a lot of copycat robberies, first of all. Second of all, there were also a lot of robberies that the government and the police couldn't figure out who really did it. So what would they do? They'd say, blame it on the James gang. It saved doing the real police investigating. But Jesse and the gang always wore their Confederate uniforms on their raids, on their operations, because these were military operations. I'll tell you one quick story, and then we'll be out of time for this week's TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Show. And that was one of the churches that Jesse was pastoring figured out that their pastor was Jesse James and that their choir members and Sunday school teachers were the James gang. And so they had a business meeting. And at the end of the business meeting, they decided that since Jesse was under orders from General Pike, the president of the underground Confederate government, since they were engaged in a military operation, that as soldiers, that they could kill people and steal things as acts of war, and that these not be considered acts of theft or murder in violation of the Ten Commandments, because these are actions of war, and that they were, in essence, following the orders of a properly constituted authority. And so at the end of the day, the church decided not to take any discipline against these members. But their identities were revealed nonetheless, and so they had to resign their positions in the church and leave town really quick. But these were honorable men. And, I only had a half an hour broadcast today, so I really didn't have the time to spend on this that I would have liked to have spent. But I'd like for you to go to the TBR website, www.barnesreview.org. Find out how to get your hands on a copy of my article on Jesse James, the Baptist Bandit. Go to my website, www.dixieheritage.net. And subscribe to my free newsletter. And when you do, I'll send you a free copy of my book, The Truth About the Confederate Battle Flag. So from all of us here at TBR Radio presents the Dixie Heritage Show, until next week, God bless.